Mariari Chigalan, Mandangu, and Yurigu, Yurugari to Yurian Rajugalari, the Miloroi. Good evening, friends. Thank you for coming together today. And my name is Tracy Ryan. I'm a Rajugalari and Miloroi. As Deputy Chair of the Western Branch of the Royal Society of New South Wales, I'm filling in for Mark Evans this evening, who's off doing some very exciting things with the College of Public Policy at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. You can follow along with his adventures on LinkedIn. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am in Wiradjuri Narumba this evening, Dubuda in Dublin. I'm always grateful to those custodians of country that came before me. I acknowledge that I walk the paths that they have created for me, and I'm always learning from my ancestors and elders past and present. I'd like to note that this week is Aboriginal Languages Week, and it's such an important thing to acknowledge where we come from, what it's taken to preserve our knowledges, and the effort to rebuild for our young ones and future generations. In discussing and working to achieve educational equity for First Nations people, we need equity in the academy. And perhaps in rethinking the why of higher education, we can progress in action towards a shared future of open learning and understanding of and for all people. Some quick housekeeping before we start. Anyone who has submitted questions already to Slido, thank you. We very much appreciate those. If you have any questions during the session, please use the Slido provision that is available to you in Zoom. And submit those questions. We'll get into those when the presentation is completed. We'll get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Distinguished Professor and Dean, Professor Sarah O'Shea. Professor O'Shea is an internationally acclaimed researcher, educator, and leader in educational equity. This evening, she will explore critical issues around equitable access to tertiary education and challenge us to rethink the very purpose of universities in Australia. Speaking on equity in the academy, rethinking the why of higher education, please welcome Professor Sarah O'Shea.
Thank you for joining me this evening for this presentation, Equity Within the Academy, Rethinking the Why of Higher Education. Before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm upon today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, to elders past, present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal community that continues to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly acknowledges and respects Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future, I hope. As I prepared for this presentation, I was reflecting on some of the research I've conducted in rural and remote settings, given that I am now working at Charles Sturt University, which has such a wonderful footprint across regional New South Wales and beyond. And while I've not directly researched with Charles Sturt University yet, I did remember a memorable project in Dubbo, nearly 6 years ago now, with high school students from across the far west of New South Wales. This project was called Shift in Space and Self, moving from community to university, and it was really quite memorable. We bussed about 30 to 40 students and teachers from across the far west into Dubbo, and over 2 days we asked them to create digital stories about how they regarded their future after schooling. And you can see them doing this in these photos. We also conducted interviews and focus groups with the students and their teachers and asked them to think about and draw pictures about what their future after school might look like. Now, I was quite intrigued by this picture. Initially, I thought it was the memory of a wonderful skiing holiday. But when I asked the young man who drew it, he said no, that this actually represented how he saw his future after school. A bit like hurtling down a mountain at high speed on skis, he saw this as both scary and exhilarating. His plan was to move from his local community to a university in an urban setting. And he was scared of this in many ways because this move would require him shifting from his family, his community, everything he knew. But it was also exhilarating because of the new opportunities that it represented for him. In fact, we wrote a journal article about this tension of having to move away to achieve a job or education versus the idea of staying, which could have negative connotations. Some of the young people talked about staying as failing, and others explained how in order to return to their community, they actually had to leave in order to get an education. We also interviewed university students who had made this move, and they reflected on the lived experience of this mobility, revealing how this can be quite an emotional process. This resulted in very different ways of viewing university, particularly when the university was not regional, like Charles Sturt, and required moving vast distances. In many ways, this project reflects a lot of the research I've done over the years. I've worked mainly with university students, but also learners in schools and VET, and have conducted many thousands of interviews now, actually, to really unpack what attending university is like for them. Now, some of you in the audience might be a little skeptical of this. It all sounds a little easy. You know, I work in a university and I research with students. But quite unlike some of my research colleagues who may have long hours of lab work, may have to wrangle rodents or locate exotic species in order to extract, you know, scientifically validated outcomes. Well, it's perhaps not as easy as it sounds. Being what we call an insider researcher means having to view your data through a hypercritical lens. And sometimes I have to focus that lens on my own employer. Sorry, Vice-Chancellor. My particular focus is on educational equity. I've been an educational equity advocate now for nearly 30 years. My vision has been to ensure that individual educational choices are not constrained by material wealth, postcode, or family biography. Not only have I championed the rights for all individuals to participate equally in education, but I've also collaborated with students, colleagues, and indeed policymakers with the simple goal of achieving equity across higher education. We know that significant numbers of our students fall into the 6 identified equity groups. And while these groups were identified back in the 1990s, and there is some questions around whether they're still valuable, more recent research has indicated that, you know, so many of our students fall into multiple equity groups. Now, this interest in equitable access to education is no doubt related to my own biography and history. As Walter Gilbert, a Nobel laureate, has said, we're often drawn to research things that have a significance to ourselves. Growing up in a small village in Ireland, my earliest recollections relate to the importance of learning and education. My parents had both left school at 16, and for me, university was a vague and rather elusive thing. But the importance of gaining an education was not only articulated by my own parents, but also reflected more widely in the community. And indeed, I feel the rather troubled history of Ireland. The value placed upon having an education, I think, is also linked to memories of a time in Ireland when education was not available to everyone, where if you had a certain faith or background, you were precluded from getting an education. This prohibition led to illegal schools, or what were termed hedge schools, which were established in the 18th and 19th century. These were schools for the poor, and they were often established in the sunny side or the lee side of a hedge, where a travelling scholar would set up a legal school, a hedge school, and local farmers' children would pay a few pennies in order to learn the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and in some cases even Latin and Greek. These schools were finally legitimised with the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829, but the history books reflect on a terrible thirst for knowledge within the Irish countryside and the ultimate failure to use education as a tool of social control. And I think this also points to the fact that education is deeply political and I feel needs constant critical interrogation. My own pathway through education has been somewhat disjointed. While I did go to university after school, I have actually weaved my life around education, returning at many stages in my life. As you can see from this picture, I managed having children and also engaging in university, and can I say at this point also quite questionable choices in hairstyle. I started doing a PhD with 2 young preschoolers, and I include this second photo to only say I think that we both got a little bit better with age, and certainly my hairstyle did. Even in the decades I've attended university, I've seen dramatic shifts. Historically, attending university was definitely reserved for the elites. It was both exclusive and exclusionary. Globally, universities have purposely moved away from this elite system to what is now regarded as a universal system with the main goal of preparing graduates for the professions. This shift is reflected in the growth in student numbers. Since the 70s, the global student population has multiplied over 6 times, with significant growth predicted in large continents such as Asia. Higher education has become less about being a rite of passage and more about creating the necessary human capital needed to ensure growth in economy. The more our economy grows, the greater the demand for students to attain a higher degree qualification, with the number of jobs requiring a degree predicted to double over the next 25 to 30 years in Australia. And this growth in student numbers has similarly led to universities becoming big businesses. Education is now our 4th largest export after coal, iron ore and natural gas, and it generates in excess of $36 billion a year. But increased numbers and revenue has had significant repercussions for our learners. In terms of money, whilst more students are being encouraged to attend university, they will now spend upwards of $40,000 to $50,000 to get that education. In fact, with the recent changes to degree costs and also indexation of HECS, we now know that currently over 56,000 people have a HECS help debt that is 6 figures. That's a lot of money, 6 figures. In the 1980s, about 35% of our university students worked, and now that has grown to about 70%. We have many commuter campuses where learners rush from work to study, and lectures are no longer intimate gatherings, but actually huge congregations. At the same time, some students feel that they have been somewhat cheated. In a study I did a few years ago, where I interviewed graduates who had entered into the job market, all of whom were the first in their family to go to university, they expressed how disappointed they were about the university education. And I think this is summed up by this particular survey respondent who felt that she was sold a degree much like being sold an ice cream. With debt and the need to juggle multiple responsibilities, it's perhaps not surprising that equity participation in Australia has flatlined. Attending university is inherently risky, particularly for those from less wealthy backgrounds. In fact, there is every possibility that university debt can entrench poverty rather than offer the opportunity to improve it. University is also increasingly sidelined as students struggle to manage work and also study simultaneously. Given this dire situation, it's perhaps not surprising that the last 2 years has seen one of the biggest reviews of higher education sector in Australia. The Universities Accord challenged us to do what I call the 3 Bs, to think big, be bold, and create a blueprint for higher education for the next decade and beyond. The report mentions the term equity 197 times. Well, it did when I did my word count, and includes goals to increase the number of students from underrepresented groups, ultimately leading to 80% of all working-aged people having a tertiary qualification by 2050. Now, I definitely welcome the Accord and its recommendations. There are things, though, that are missing. Most obviously are the very complex circumstances that equity students encounter and the barriers that they often meet in their educational journeys. The report has also been criticised for leaving out one really important component, and that is the actual voices of the students themselves. In fact, colleagues have called for a students' accord, which would better represent the need of learners rather than the sector. But to be fair to universities, there are also a lot of complexities that exist, because higher education institutions are expected to be both the engine rooms for prosperity, creating the next wave of human capital, but also social levelers that will help social mobility. This is really problematic, and I think necessitates exploring the university's why, the purpose of our sector, notwithstanding the material barriers, for example, financial risk, the need to juggle multiple responsibilities. The very ways of being in a university can often subtly reflect middle-class values, which in turn can be very alienating for many learners from more diverse backgrounds. But demonstrating this complexity is actually quite difficult. I cannot really show it through data or experiments. Well, I could try. If I'm really to explain the why of human action, then I feel I've got to use the words of humans. So I want to present in the next few slides the story of just one learner. Whilst I've interviewed well over 1,000, this particular learner stands out for a key reason. And that is because she allowed me to travel with her as she proceeded through her degree and engaged in interviews on multiple occasions at critical stages of her studies. So, meet Elle. Elle is not an archetype. You know, she is not an ideal student in the sense that I've pulled together lots of different learners. She is very, very unique. But across her story, there are many common themes and elements that echo what other learners have told me. Elle is first in her family to come to university. She left school at 16 and married quite young. She's had a series of casual part-time jobs, but always felt that she could do better. When Elle was first interviewed, she was living in a local housing commission estate. She was a sole parent and reflected on being on a very low income and also managing a mental health issue. Obviously, these were all factors that impacted her university journey. But Elle's demographic is not that unusual. You know, we have very complex students. For example, over 40% are over 25 years. Over 50% are first in their family to come to university. 58% are reported as worrying about finances. And in a recent study by Universities Australia, 15% of the students that they interviewed and surveyed regularly reported going without food or other necessities. But yet, images of students like Elle remain conspicuously absent from how we imagine university students. And I think this demonstrates, this slide demonstrates this, because if you Google the term university students, you'll notice that older students are noticeably missing from the images that pop up. And this, of course, is quite problematic. Like many other equity students, the decision to attend university for Elle was a very complex one. I've often heard from students, both young and old, that the decision is provoked by a catalyst. In Elle's case, this catalyst was a relationship breakdown, but other students have talked about an illness, a job loss, a birth of a child, or another significant life event that for some reason prompted them to consider university, which was often a long-held dream or ambition. But the histories or biographies of our learners often remain somewhat silent. And some might say this is because of privacy. But in fact, most of the students I've spoken to crave or desire that more human touch. They really want to be more than just a face in a Zoom room or a lecture theatre. This decision was often equally not just an individual one, but one that impacted on those around the learner as well. University could be conceived as a route out of poverty, a future imaginary that would benefit not only the learners, but also their families and communities. Being successful or not then was a collective endeavour. There was many people watching on the sidelines, particularly this is the case for those who are first in the family. And often those bystanders are watching to see whether the student in their family makes it or not. And if they don't, that sends a fairly negative message back through the generations. In this first interview with Elle, she was actually accompanied by her mother. And her mother also reflected on how Elle's decision to come to university reverberated through the entire family. Many bystanders were witnessing Elle's journey, and this might put additional and somewhat invisible pressure on this journey. Let's be clear here. You know, attending university is a significant life event for many of these learners. It's not a rite of passage or a part of an expected trajectory, but often a radical detour to what was expected or predicted. In my own research with students, particularly women, it is this deeply transformative nature of education participation that they reflect upon, not only for themselves, but also for those around them and their family members. But so much of this transformation remains largely hidden in the university environment. These powerful shifts do not seem to be counted or valued. Instead, the particular contexts and lived experience of our equity-bearing students remain somewhat invisible. When we rejoin Elle in 2017 for the second interview, she has progressed through her degree and reflects upon her experiences. Elle has felt an acute difference. She was uncertain of the correct protocols, questioning herself every step of the way. She adapted over time and explained she spent a lot of time watching and learning how to behave. In other words, Elle had to adapt to the institution. The institution did not adapt to Elle. When I asked Elle if she felt successful, it was clear that academic success was not simply about getting good grades or getting a job at the end, but it was also about her own growth as an individual, particularly her growth in identity, and her ability to persevere despite obstacles. There was very little mention of Elle's success being measured only in terms of attaining a job at the end of it all. In fact, more expansive understanding of success have been echoed by other learners that I have been engaged with over the years, where success was often defined in far more expansive ways. For example, it was about defying the odds. You know, that this was something that they may well have wanted for many, many years, and they had overcome a lot of barriers to achieve. It was something that was validating. Again, for many learners, they'd been told that university was not for the likes of them, and so attaining a university degree in itself was hugely successful. And sometimes this could be very emotional and embodied. Effectively, though, these perspectives clash very clearly with meritocratic assumptions of success. Attending university is not only conceived in terms of getting a job or obtaining that piece of paper, but spoke to something far more fundamental. By the third interview, and at this stage, Elle had completed university, she reflected on the very big step she had taken and how this feeling of being an outsider was deeply rooted in her biography and background. For Elle, though, her background was not a negative, but instead she recognised that her personal circumstances provided the impetus, if you like, to keep going, or as Elle described, to break those barriers or rules, but then hastens to assure me, not in an illegal way. In short, and to be clear, Elle's life experience or biography was not a problem or a deficit to be fixed or changed. Instead, it was precisely this combination of university study and life experience that provided her with the tools to contribute to her community. Elle's contribution to society after graduation extended far beyond economics. As you can see from these quotes, she is working with young people who have dropped out of education and getting them back on that path. In fact, at this point, she's also considering returning to university and conducting research in the field. What Elle's story also clearly highlights is that if universities truly want to invite people from diverse backgrounds to come in, and clearly we should, and indeed the Universities Accord is setting those ambitious targets, it is vitally important that we really consider our why as a sector, or the purpose of higher education. So I think there's a few lessons that can be learnt from Elle's story, and I want to use the next few slides to talk briefly about those. As Elle's story demonstrated, family and community are heavily invested in this educational decision-making. This decision can have ripple effect down through the generations, and as I mentioned, this is particularly significant for first and family learners. But universities are actually not very good at getting to know the complex life situations of their learners. They tend instead to decontextualize students. Some universities are deliberately drawing upon AI and technology to address these gaps in knowledge and also details of our learners. But I think we need to be very careful around this application and how we might use this understanding, which should always be used with an equity framing. So in this era of big data and AI, and while they're exciting, I think we need to think about how we might get to know our students a little better, but equally carefully construct that understanding so that it effectively informs university entry, curriculum design and delivery. We also need to rethink our degrees and how these are structured and offer what the Productivity Commission calls an orderly and low-cost exit from higher education. This would include a move away from focusing only on degrees and providing nested qualifications that enable learners to leave early and evidence learning, but also support a nationally or even internationally coordinated approach to recognition of prior learning, so that individuals can move seamlessly back into education when they desire. We know there's no such thing as a linear pathway to higher education. In fact, in a study that I conducted quite recently, we asked young people who were at university to reflect back on the pathways they'd taken there and asked them to draw visual maps around that journey. And as you can see from these two examples, it was rarely linear. Students like Elle often feel like they don't belong at university. And some of this relates to the access to what we call insider knowledge, or what Ball and Vincent refer to as hot and cold knowledge. Hot knowledge, or grapevine knowledge, comes from those closest to you. It's that local or contextualized insight into educational institutions, often regarded as more legitimate than cold or official knowledge or sources that are derived from the institution. But for those who are first in their family or community to go to university, they often rely on those cold knowledge sources. And as the previous images show, they may not see themselves in university. So it is key that prospective students have access to this hot knowledge. And I talk about the intentional creation of what I term hot knowledge networks, alongside a deliberate opening up of what we term the hidden curriculum, which are often the practices and protocols that are hidden within the ways we act in universities. Like the learners who participated in that digital story project in Dubbo I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there are very different educational experiences for learners in country Australia. In fact, country Australians are less than half as likely to have a degree by the age of 35 compared to their urban counterparts. Where you are located really matters, and different locations require quite different solutions. Regional universities like Charles Sturt often do the heavy lifting in this regard with very little additional funding. What we need is more place-based pathways that draw upon a diversity of educational providers working collaboratively to enable students to stay local if they wish. This would avoid implicitly devaluing the local and regional. Imagine a national system that allowed students to pathway seamlessly between educational providers, not just universities and vet providers, but also community colleges, regional university centres, even libraries, allowing them to free them to stay rather than leave. Finally, it's not just universities that need to rethink their why, but also how we do schooling. Similar to Elle, who left school at 16, about 1 in 5 students will leave school before year 12. And those living in poverty, rural remote locations, or those that identify from being from a First Nations background, this figure increases. This is a picture of an alternative high school that I was involved setting up down on the south coast of New South Wales. The school simply does school differently, as the picture states. And what it does is it offers scaffolding and support to learners, small class groups. And it started in 2019 with just a handful of Year 9-10 students. And I'm very pleased to say that last year it graduated its first cohort of Year 12s, with many of them going on to university. Now, I'm not saying that this school is right for everyone. What I am saying is that we need to have more educational choices at that schooling level. I am certain that there is not one person listening to this presentation that doesn't see the value in ensuring an equitable education system. Imagine for just a moment a university system that caters to the particular needs of individual learners, providing the necessary support and scaffolding to ensure simply that every learner is on a level playing field. A system where an equity lens is applied to all decisions and where there are partnerships and collaborations built exclusively to benefit equity groups rather than spreadsheets. And look, there are pockets of some wonderful work going on across Australia and also overseas. Indeed, there is some great work going on in Charles Sturt. But I want to talk a little bit about what's happening internationally and just draw on two examples that stand out from my perspective. One is Arizona State University, who's actually created a university charter that explicitly states its commitment to inclusion and demonstrates this through socially informed partnership. In recent years, ASU has partnered with big businesses such as Starbucks and Uber to offer free tuition to all staff and in some cases their families. This is so significant as it not only benefits the employer, but also the staff. And ASU create not only the opportunity to undertake a degree, but also to receive scholarships and indeed scaffolded support. Another example is Manchester Met University, who works with its alumni to create opportunity for students from first and family backgrounds. The First Gen campaign commenced in 2017 with a goal of transforming 1,000 lives. And I was lucky enough to visit MMU in 2018 when the first cohort of students were coming through this programme. This is a scaffolded approach that pairs learners with first and family alumni. And the alumni work with students from school right through their university degrees and after they graduate, not only providing that insider knowledge, that hot knowledge that I talked about, but also creating the necessary professional networks that learners will need if they want to achieve their professional goals. The relationship starts in the last years of school and provides a philanthropic scholarship, as well as access to exclusive approaches for career and university study. Another thing MMU does really well is foreground the diversity of their staff. And you'll see here a picture of a badge that all staff that are first and family wear in order to highlight that the diversity of the student population is equally reflected in the staff. So where do we start? Well, perhaps it's not quite as difficult as we all think. The higher education threshold standards, which are the standards that all universities have to adhere to, clearly articulate how universities need to demonstrate strong civic leadership. But how we define that civic leadership is a little bit vague. Personally, I like this definition, which was provided by one of our longest-serving Vice-Chancellors, Margaret Gardner. For me, it is this civic responsibility that needs to be the cornerstone of how we need to consider the why of universities moving forward. Remembering that universities do not trigger egalitarian societies on their own, although they do play a very important role in facilitating them. Think for the moment of a university system built upon a pedagogy of care that ensures students feel like they matter rather than instructing them to belong. Establishing such parameters starts with not only having a clear understanding of who our students are, the complexities of their lives, the strengths they bring with them, but also a much better articulated understanding of the purpose of higher education. And so I will end with this thought. Perhaps when it comes to equity in the academy, it's less about rethinking our why and actually more about remembering our why. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarah O'Shea. That was really spot on, right on the money for a lot of things that I'm living with through my kids actually at the moment, who are all young people who have not achieved HSCs but have gone on to university. So looking at that equity equity in action.
Thank you,
I do
Tracy.
have a couple of questions for you if you're up for it. We've got about 20 minutes, so we've got a handful of questions to go through. So first of all, you mentioned being both a researcher of educational equity as well as somebody who's been involved in actually creating equity and doing equity, so to speak. Could you expand on some of the practical activities that you've been involved in?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I sort of feel in a way my career has been a bit circular because I mentioned in the presentation, you know, I was part of a group of people who set up that alternative school down on the South Coast. But actually my first role when I came to Australia was teaching young people who were disengaged from learning. They had dropped out of school, and I had quite an eclectic group that I was teaching. You know, some had been expelled, some had learning difficulties. And I think that really opened my eyes up to how transformational education can be. And I moved from that into the vet sector. And I worked with people who a lot were recent migrants and refugees, and they often weren't literate in their first language. And so I was trying to teach them to be, you know, to read and write in English. And yeah, I suppose that's where I got my real interest in the field. So moving into the higher ed system, the higher education system, then I realized that there was a lot of work that we could do to make this pathway into university a lot easier. And so a lot of my work on the more practical end, you know, while I've done the research, on a more applied way, I've tended to work a lot with students. So I've worked in co-design and students as partners, developing initiatives that really come from the ground up. And some of the examples of things I've been involved in is, you know, the mentoring, you know, so I talked about in the presentation that hot knowledge, you know, and the importance of that hot knowledge, that insider knowledge. And really, we have this great capacity to provide that to learners if we can utilize our existing learners, because they know what that knowledge is. So that's one example. I've also been involved in a lot of career-related work to ensure that we're not sort of developing graduates that don't have the skills then beyond university to actually get into the professions that they want. So yeah, it's been quite a journey so far.
It certainly sounds like it, but one that you've clearly really enjoyed and gotten a lot out of yourself. So what would you say is one of your more memorable or innovative research projects that you work with students from those diverse backgrounds here?
Yeah, again, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've really enjoyed those projects embedded in collaboration with students. And I also actually like the way that my work is informed quite deeply by research as well. So a lot of the research projects I've undertaken, because my background is sociology of education, so I do adopt that critical lens often on my employer. And one project, which was actually funded by the Australian Research Council, was looking at how students persisted at university. So we have a lot of studies that have looked at why students leave university, but there actually hasn't been a lot of research to highlight, well, why do they keep going? And quite frankly, some of the students that I've talked to over the years, I've thought in my own mind, I don't know how you keep going, quite literally. So I used a very sort of a combination of theories. So looking at the capitals and the capabilities that people come with and how they draw down on those capitals to actually, you know, become successful at university. And out of that, I developed like a capability-informed framework to help people who are looking at strategies that can help students to persist. So I quite like that piece of work. And another piece of work I was involved in was with colleagues over in the UK and in Australia, where we deconstructed this idea of student belonging, because a lot of universities are very focused on student belonging, particularly when it comes to equity students. But actually, you know, you sort of saying to people, well, you know, we have it in our student experience surveys, you know, do you feel like you belong to the institution? When you talk to students, they actually will say, well, certainly the ones we talk to, you know what, that's another layer of that you're putting on me in an already complex situation. You know, I can't be instructed to belong. Maybe I don't want to belong in the way that you think I should belong, because there's very clear ways of looking at what belonging should be and how it should be enacted. So out of that project, we actually completely deconstructed this idea of what student belonging is, and developed some resources actually for teachers and academics so that they could actually reflect themselves on what that belonging might look like. So that's another project that I'm, you know, I really enjoyed.
I can see that I have some reading to go away and do. And for anyone else who missed that, it's the capability informed framework. Google that. So we've got another couple of questions. So governments who fund universities don't accord much value to the civic society and overall social well-being. What could change that?
Oh, I'm getting the tough ones, haven't I?
That's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I mentioned it in the presentation. You know, universities do have to exist in this duality, and you see it all the time, you know, where universities are both expected to create these this human capital, you know, the people that are going to fuel the economy, but they're also supposed to be the social levelers that will create social mobility. So I think, you know, one of the things I'm always considering in my mind is what would push governments to actually realize the civic leadership and the key cornerstone that is. Well, part of it is that they actually need to invest in students. We need graduates. It's very clear, the statistics point to it. But as the statistics also point that the equity numbers are flatlining. You know, we're not getting students. Students are not from those diverse backgrounds, aren't coming in. So I am hopeful that eventually the penny will drop, that actually, if you want to invest in learners, you need to rethink the values that higher education is sometimes built upon, you know. And that doesn't mean a radical departure, but it does mean that civic leadership becomes far more important, because I think with that will become a more equitable higher education system.
Thank you, Sarah. What advice do you have about bridging the research practice divide so research like yours can be embedded into practice?
Oh yeah, another great question.
A lot of PD for our academics and professional staff, maybe.
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose it's not easy sometimes doing. I'm not going to pretend it's easy doing the research that I do, because it's very difficult to get that traditional funding, you know. But what I do think is that whatever you're doing, and if it's applied, to think about how it could be grounded in research, in empirical findings. So whenever I've done applied work in my own roles, I've always underpinned that with theory. I've underpinned it with research, and I've often staged my work as well. So the ARC grant, for example, that I mentioned, that built on a lot of other work I'd done, much smaller grants, and much smaller projects. And I was able to sort of show through those that there was a real gap in our understanding. So, I mean, it doesn't really answer the question, because it's not easy work. It's not as straightforward. For example, if you're working in the hard sciences and you can point to a particular problem and you can say, you know, if I'm given this sort of funding, I can address that problem, because the issue of educational equity is very complex. But that complexity means that we have to keep working at it and keep interrogating it. So the research is very important.
It's a bit like setting goals for ourselves, really. We've got to keep setting goals that we then work out, what do we need to achieve? How are we going to achieve that? Taking step by step and evaluating as we go, and planning and looking at what evidence there is to support what we're doing. And it's just a constant process, a work in process, really.
Absolutely. And, you know, the thing about wicked problems like this, which, you know, that's the technical term, you know, they are wicked problems, is to be curious, you know, to really, if there's something that you think, why is that like that? Then pursue that curiosity, because often that can lead you to very interesting places.
I'm so glad to hear you mention careers advice for students. We've got lots of careers people in the audience, maybe. Perhaps because there needs to be more that happens here. Do you have any advice or insights on that sort of arena?
Yeah, so you and I have sort of bonded over this one, haven't we, Tracy?
We have.
We've bonded over a few different things.
Now we've got another fellow to join us, Tim. Tim's right into career development as well.
So yeah, I think with careers, I'm probably you know this, but we do need to take less of a transactional approach to careers and more of a career development learning approach. I mean, careers need to be careers sort of support and development, and thinking about this needs to be embedded in schooling way back, and quite intentional, because you know, I get a little tired of hearing and reading about the need to raise young people's aspirations. I mean, young people have aspirations. They just may not have the map to get to where they need to go. And so there's a real role in a more holistic approach to career development to help them map that journey, for the want of a better word. Yeah.
Very true. I think you're absolutely spot on there. Career development and planning can't be underestimated. And even sometimes I think we make things harder for ourselves by referring to careers all the time, because it makes people think that they've got to come up with this huge picture right at the beginning of the journey. And you don't. Your career is a thing that you will reflect on down the track of all the things you've built along the way, and all the people who helped you get there. On to the next question. What do you make of powerful knowledge? A strong discourse in South Africa that we do students an epistemological injustice by catering to local knowledges. Oh, want me to read that one again?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you make of powerful knowledge, a strong discourse in South Africa that we are doing students an epistemological injustice by catering to local knowledges?
Well, that makes me very curious to go and read about powerful knowledge. So I can see, I think I understand. I'm not familiar with the concept of powerful knowledge, I'll be honest, but it might be that if we focus on local knowledges, are we then not preparing maybe our learners for that more Western knowledge base? But actually, I feel quite strongly that local knowledge, those epistemologies that challenge dominant epistemologies or dominant knowledge bases, are so important, because I actually don't think, if I can get very large now, I actually don't think we're going to find the answers to the very complex world issues that we're dealing with unless we embrace local knowledges, I'll be honest. But saying that, I'm very curious now to go and have a read about powerful knowledge and understand that a little bit more.
Yes, I agree. And you know, I think we all know where I stand on local knowledges as a Wiradjuri woman. So if universities tailored their offerings to meet learner needs, would degrees be more costly? And would that turn off equity students from wanting to attend university?
Well, I quite like degrees to have no cost, but
Wouldn't we all?
yeah, I mean, yeah. So, but that aside, if they were tailored to individual learners, would that turn off equity students? I don't think so. I was reading quite recently a EY report on future-proofing higher education, and this was quite an interesting report because EY, Ernst Young, they look at the big trends globally, and then they applied that lens to higher education to sort of say, right, this is what you need to be looking at. And one of the points they said was that, you know, in the future, that learners will want to stream their learning much like they stream Spotify, you know, that if we've got this ability to work wherever we want to work, then learners will equally want to learn wherever they are. And so I think we've got to rethink how our delivery very carefully. And in fact, but it's important to do that with an equity framing, you know. So we need to make sure we're not unintentionally excluding people when we move to different forms of delivery. And that's why I think it's so important that actually equity is very much central to any decisions in universities now, rather than sort of adding it on afterwards and bolting it on. We actually need to look at everything now with an equity framing. You know, think about, well, what are the equity implications for this? What might, you know, how might this impact learners from more diverse backgrounds? So I think it won't turn off equity students if it is done appropriately and in that sort of with that equity lens.
Might allow for some really specialised ways of learning and doing things down the track. We do have a shout out from the CSU Careers and Skills team. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for listening and watching and joining in. They are listening intently, they say, and it is lovely to hear from you guys again. I started my CSU journey during the Careers and Skills team. So if universities, and we might have to make this one our last question. Oh no, we've read that one. That was the turning off the question. So did you have any final comments that you'd like to make in our last few minutes, do you think? In a dream world, what happens next?
Oh, in a dream world, I would deeply love that university was free, you know, that educational choices were not limited by, you know, your wealth, your background, your biography. Yeah, so I mean, in a dream world, but equally, you know, I think there's so much good work going on and so much passion to see our higher education system, indeed our entire education system, to be equitable. So I just think we need to harness that passion and really work collectively to do that.
Yeah. I think it's such a big job, isn't it? That sometimes that's what we balk at, is that there's so much to do in order to reach a true equity that goes from preschool right through to higher education and to postgraduate work as well. But it's such a big mission. And, you know, we've just got to tap the right people on the shoulders to start having those conversations and doing that work. And look, thank you very much, Sarah. This has been incredibly enlightening. And as usual, always things that I like to hear and talk about. So I hope that our audience has enjoyed this as much as I have. I really have enjoyed what you were talking about today. And I can't say thank you enough for bringing that to our audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. We are wrapping up at 7 o'clock, so we're pretty much on the dot for everybody who has other things to go and do. This is our final provocation for this year, but we will be back in 2025 with a whole new series, and we're off to plan that in the coming months. So thank you very much for joining us to all of those, and we look forward to seeing you all again next year.
Thank you.